All right, so we have been studying the book of Esther. We're almost done. I had indicated that we would finish it up this week, but I'm actually not going to. So I need one more teaching to do this because I'm actually not going to move today into the next part of the book. There's something that we've already seen in this story that I don't want to miss the opportunity to address. And so we will still be in Esther the next time that I teach. But before that, there's the fifth Sunday thing that they were just talking about. And then I'm out of town. And so it's going to be like 3 weeks before we get Esther done. All right. So anyway, maybe you weren't here last week. Maybe you've never been here before. Maybe you just can't remember anything from 1 week to the next. But this is the verse that's at the end of chapter 7 that we ended last week on. It says, "So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated." And so last week we used this verse as an opportunity to point out the irony that's apparent in this story, like the whirlwind of a day that Haman had, where it kind of started with him believing that his enemy was about to be destroyed and that the king wanted to show him the highest honor. And then that day ended with him dead on the spike that he had built for Mordecai. And then at the end of the teaching last week, we used this verse as an opportunity to kick into talking about what it takes to abate the wrath of the real king. And so this was our transition into talking about the gospel. This morning, we're going to start with this verse, and we're going to look backward through this story at Haman and at a particular characteristic of his. So you guys like to be around people that you consider to be arrogant? Right? It's kind of a trick question, because if you liked to be around them, then you probably wouldn't consider them to be arrogant, even if they are. How about people that are conceited, or maybe full of themselves? And again, you wouldn't use that kind of language to describe them if you like to be around them, because that language is connected to extremely negative things and extremely negative ways of thinking about people. And so a bunch of our language about this kind of posture that people have is negative in its associations. So snob and self-important, big-headed, stuck up, vain, know-it-all, right? They're all things that we say that are bad. All right, we don't have a lot of nice ways to talk about this particular human characteristic. But there's one word that if it were not for the Bible's take on this word, we actually use it mostly to talk about this same characteristic in a positive way. Haman was full of pride. And when the Bible uses that word, we recognize that it's saying something that it's really bad. But when we use that word outside of Christian culture, it's generally not an accusation or a condemnation or really even derogatory. So we're going to go back through this story, and we're going to take a look at the ways that Haman demonstrated his pride. And we're going to look at the ways that his pride steered him towards that end that we just saw at the end of chapter 7. And I want you to try to be honest with yourself here. As we talk about pride and or arrogance, it is extremely likely that there's a specific face or a specific name that comes into your mind. There are people, or there's a person that we each consider to be extremely arrogant. Right? We know people that look down on other people. and that make us feel judged by the way that they look at us or their tone of voice when they talk to us. And there are those people that just have to be the center of attention and that, talk too loudly when they're talking about themselves. They interrupt your story so that they can tell their story that your story made them think of. And then when certain topics come up, they jump into the conversation to show off how much they know. They seem to delight in pointing out where you were wrong about what you just said. Are those people that you enjoy being around the most? No, right? No. When we think that someone is arrogant, it definitely rubs us the wrong way. And when we talk about pride in this negative way, this somewhat biblical way, we have no trouble at all spotting this flaw in other people. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says about pride that it's a fault which makes, there is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. So how do you feel when you're spending time with someone, or after you've spent time with someone that you think is a proud person, right? Or that you feel judged by? What does it elicit in you when a person clearly thinks that they are better than you? Or a person that's on some kind of crazy power trip and just behaves as if they're in charge of everything? Is it nice to talk to that person that monopolizes all conversation and that makes all conversation about them? Well, you probably don't enjoy very much the time that you spend with that person. You may even be pretty mad at feeling belittled and pushed aside in the whole thing. And according to what we just saw that Lewis said about pride, the way that we feel about proud people is actually the way that we can tell if we are prideful. And the more pride that you have yourself, the more you will dislike it in other people. That should be a sobering thought. All right, so maybe you and your spouse have just spent the evening with another couple of people, and one of those people makes you feel the way that we're talking about here. And on the ride home, or after they leave, or whatever, have you ever asked your spouse if you come across the same way that that other person comes across? And if your spouse is feeling charitable, they will say, "No, honey, of course not." And when they say that, how do you react internally? I'll tell you how I react. I feel relieved. I feel good about myself. I'm thankful that I don't come across like that other person does. So do you see what I just did there? I've looked down on someone else because I thought they were proud. And I've seen myself as better than someone else who came across as full of themselves. So Joseph Epstein was the editor of American Scholar magazine from 1975 until 1997. And when he was talking about this same dynamic, he said, "So many people hate snobs, but you can only hate snobs if you feel superior to them. And that's simply another form of snobbery." It's a trap, right? We look down on arrogant people and that reveals our own arrogance and our own pride without us ever realizing it. It reveals it, but not to us. So Tim Keller said in a sermon that by definition, the more proud you are, the less proud you think you are. So this little rap this morning is about pride. But the idea is that you would not be thinking about someone else, someone that you think is prideful. All right, we each have plenty of pride of our own to not be distracted by the pride that we see in someone else. And so I lean pretty heavily into C.S. Lewis in matters that gravitate towards the philosophical aspects of the Christian life. So here's another thing that he said in Mere Christianity. If anyone wants to acquire humility, you must realize that you're proud. Nothing can be done before this. If you think that you are not conceited, it means that you are very conceited indeed. The only way that this subject is going to have any impact on your life is if you take it very personally. So of all the characters in the Bible, Haman is the most sustained case study that we have on the subject of pride. And so that's why we're going to take the time to go through this before we move on. There must be some things that we can learn about pride from the guy that the Bible holds up as like the pride guy. All right, so we're going to look for what pride does, and we're going to try and figure out where pride comes from. And then Haman is going to demonstrate exactly what pride leads to. All right, spoiler alert. Right? He ends up on a spike. So if we start with the first one, makes the most sense. We're first going to look at what pride does. And so Haman first showed up in our story in Esther 3 when we're told that he has just been elevated to the second most powerful position in the empire. Only the king has more authority than Haman does. And to make sure that people are going along with the power structure in the Persian Empire, the king has commanded everyone in the kingdom to bow before Haman. But Mordecai is Jewish, and even though that fact has influenced none of his behaviors or decisions before this point, he decides to use that fact as a reason not to bow before Haman. And verses 5 and 6, tell us about Haman's reaction to this. It says that when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So take a minute to process that. Mordecai didn't bow to Haman, and Haman's pride is so wounded that the only way that he can come up with to make up for the wound is to exterminate every single Jew in the entire empire. That's millions of people, because Mordecai wouldn't bow. And that may seem just crazy to you and me, but it doesn't seem crazy to Haman. And that kind of just shows what it is that pride does. Pride makes itself the very center. And in order to do that, it uses other people to build itself up. All right, so look at how clearly we can see that in Haman. So he actually thinks that the sole reason for the existence of Jewish people is so that he can figure out a way for them to make him feel better about himself. And he's willing to kill all of them as long as it makes him look better or feel better. Pride makes itself the center, and it uses other people for our benefit. Now, you may or may not have tried to kill millions of people, but it's extremely likely that you have used other people to make yourself look better or feel better. You have probably made your feelings or your desires or your self-image the center of all things. And in your absorption with yourself, you've used other people without genuine regard for their feelings or their desires or their image of themselves. And you've used them to your benefit. And so I bet you can remember a time before you were as Christ-like as you are now, when you judged someone else's moral failure, and it made you feel good about yourself because, you haven't sinned in that same horrible way. You ever talk about someone else's problems under the pretense of trying to help them, but in actuality it's because their problems make you feel good about your own life and your own walk with God, because it shows that your life is not so wretched as this other person's. All right, that's just gossip. And it's prideful. It's judgmental, while being completely blind to the horror that your own internal life is. All right, so, you may not be trying to hurt anyone, but you're certainly using them for your own benefit, with no consideration at all for their feelings. When you're talking about your own problems and your own sin, don't you want for the people that you're talking to be like engaged and interested and empathetic? But when someone else starts to talk about their life and their issues, why do you have so much trouble staying interested and staying engaged? How about when someone else gets something that you kind of wish you had, even if you would never admit it? Do you feel a little jealous? Do you make critical comments to them or to other people about why they should not have gotten what they did, or why they don't deserve to get what they did? And it might be like other people getting a relationship or a baby or a promotion or recognized for something, right? Whatever it is, right, you're usually pretty sure that you deserve what they got more than they do. Whatever it is that you value, even a little bit, when someone else gets it, do you have a hard time being happy for them? That's pride. That's believing about yourself that you're better than others. Pride insists that it be at the center of all things. So when something good happens in someone else's life, pride makes it somehow about you and how you deserve it more than they do, and about how you feel about the whole thing. You have a hard time truly celebrating with people as things come into their life that you think you should have. All right? So that's what pride does. Right? So because pride makes us the center, and because it involves being self-absorbed, there are actually two forms of pride. All right? So there's the pride of superiority, where we compare ourselves to people and we feel that they're better than they are. All right. And then there's the pride of inferiority. All right, where we compare ourselves to other people and we feel that we are failures. And so we're like constantly beating ourselves up. And both of these responses are making everything about me. And we're probably pretty familiar with the idea of the pride of superiority. So we're going to focus on the inferiority one for a minute. And on the surface, this kind of pride, it looks a lot like humility most of the time. But everything is still really all about you. And you still use people so that you can feel better. And instead of being able to rejoice in other people's success, this form of pride chooses to focus on our own failures. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. And so if someone does something really well, then all we can think about is how much better they are than we are. And if you mess something up, then all you can think about is what a failure you are and how you'll never be any good or any use to anybody. Everyone would just be better off if you weren't around. And if someone ever dares to try and encourage us, then we make them feel like a fool because they just don't realize how unworthy we really are. And so where the pride of superiority tells us that we are the best, and we then use others to make us feel, better about ourselves, this kind of pride tells us that we're the absolute worst. And we use people to make ourselves more aware of our failures. But just as much as the pride of superiority, the pride of inferiority still makes everything about us. And it still uses other people. On the other hand, true humility comes as we recognize that we are not the center. Life is not all about you. And ideally, we would someday get to the point where we can recognize that even our own life is not all about us. But to just start on that path, we have to get straight that other people's lives are really not all about you. Okay, life is not about how good we are. And it is also not about how horrible we are. All right? It can't be, because it's not even about you. You're not at the center. C.S. Lewis again. He's explaining what humility looks like. This is from the Screwtape Letters. He says that humility is the state of mind where someone could build the best cathedral in the world and know it was the best and rejoice in it being the best without being any more or less or otherwise glad at having built it than if someone else had built it. Imagine that. Right? That's pretty good. And I'm not sure that it was him that said it first, but he has said it, and he often gets credit for saying it. Tim Keller is clarifying this issue when he says that humility isn't thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking about yourself less. So this is the last one, right? Like what pride leads to. And so the big problem at the root of pride is that as we try to put ourselves at the center of all things, or even the center of anything, really, we're going to lose. All right? There is already someone at the center of all things. And Isaiah is really clear that God is not interested in sharing his glory with anyone else. In 1 Peter 5, it says that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud. Right? He messes up their plans. He keeps them fighting for something that they'll never achieve. Proverbs says that pride goes before destruction. That's just what we saw in the book of Esther, right, as it relates to Haman. He's the second most powerful man essentially in the world. And he builds a 75-foot tall stake in his own backyard to kill some random Jewish guy who won't follow the law to bow before him. There should be nothing that stops him from doing just about whatever he wants. Certainly not stop him from doing this. But God opposes the proud. And so after Haman builds his stake, he goes to the king to make sure that it's cool if he kills this guy for breaking the law. But before he can even ask, the king commands him to honor Mordecai instead. And at the end of the day, after their second dinner, we read this. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Haman's impaled on the very stake that he built to put Mordecai on. God opposes the proud. Pride leads to opposition from God. How's that sound? So let's apply this to our own lives in case you're having any trouble with that. I mean, truthfully, there's just not a future for your pride. All of your longings to be at the center are going to amount to nothing. All right, there's a little section in Habakkuk chapter 2 that says, "Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So one day, the glory of the Lord will flood over the earth and destroy every single tower of human pride. Everything that everyone has worked to accomplish for themselves or for their own glory is going to be washed away into complete meaninglessness as we are sort of like exposed to what true glory is. There's just simply not a future for our pride. So where does that leave us, right? Is there any future at all for the people that have like kind of tried to be at the center? Is there any hope at all for those of us that have used other people as objects for our own benefit? Is it even possible for us to find freedom from this thing that seems like it's just part of who we are? If there were any hope for people like us, where would we find it? And what would it look like? Well, if Haman is our most sustained case study on pride that we have in the Bible, then Jesus is the most sustained case study that we have on humility that we have in the Bible. Jesus is our anti-Haman. All right, so in heaven, Jesus really was the center of the universe. I mean, everything really did revolve around him. And if anyone has the right to use people for their own benefit, it's him, because he created all of them. But instead of clinging to his own glory and crushing all of our pride by coming down and sending us to the eternal destruction that our pride makes us deserve, Jesus acted completely differently. In Mark 10, Jesus tells his disciples that for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus was the true center, and he let go of being the center in order to show us what true humility looks like. And instead of using people for his own good, he took on flesh and came to earth, where everything that he did was for the good of his people. I mean, look at how difficult it is for you and I to not act like we're the center of the universe, even though it is so obvious that we just are not. All right? So just imagine if we actually were the center of the universe. Okay, well, Jesus was the center of the universe, and he didn't act like it. I wonder if that was as hard for him as it would be for us. I mean, he easily could have demanded that we all bow before him and humbly serve like his every desire. But Jesus chose to come and humbly serve us. And instead of using people, he served people. On what he knew to be the last night of his life, when everything really should have been about him. Okay, he got up from the table, wrapped a towel around his waist, and washed the manure off the feet of the man that he knew was about to betray him. The humblest man to ever walk the face of the earth was God. Try to let the full impact of that sink in for a second. The humblest man to ever walk the face of the earth was God. Jesus willingly gave up the very thing that you and I are trying so desperately to grasp. And though he was God, he did not cling to his equality with God, but instead humbled himself and took on the form of a servant. That's from Philippians 2. And that's very different from the way that we roll. Even though we are created as human beings, we're constantly trying to grasp equality with God, which we do not deserve and will never achieve. We are constantly stepping on other people, trying to make ourselves higher than we really are. Even though we have seen Jesus leave the heights of heaven to come all the way down to earth to serve us and be himself humiliated. Jesus is nothing like us, and he was nothing like Haman. But strangely, he ends up dying the same kind of shameful death that Haman did. And for Haman, that makes perfect sense. All right? Pride goes before destruction, right? Haman was extremely proud, and so you would expect this to be the end for him. But what about Jesus? Right? How did he end up dying? The same shameful death that Haman did. How did the humblest man that ever walked the face of the earth end up experiencing the destruction that's reserved for the proud? Well, we find the answer to that question in 1 Peter 2:24. It says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. The humblest man that ever lived took all the pride of all God's people and bore it in his body on the cross. Jesus went to the cross to die the shameful death of the proud in our place. It was our pride. It was our desire to be at the center, and our willingness to use other people to our benefit that drove Jesus to the cross. The cross is God's antidote to our pride. It's the cure. It's freedom. Not necessarily from the pride in our lives, but from the consequences of that pride. We get to live. The cross kills our pride of superiority by showing us what we really deserve. All right, so we may get jealous when other people get what we're longing for. And, we know that we deserve it more than they do. But in the cross, we're confronted with the truth, if we're willing to see it. Right? You do not deserve a better relationship with your spouse. You deserve to die naked on a cross and enter into an eternity of suffering from the wrath of God. All right, you don't deserve a child. You don't deserve a promotion. You don't deserve to lead at church. You don't deserve a better home or a phone that isn't cracked or even the lunch with friends and family that you're about to have. You deserve the cross. It's all you deserve. You're not better than other people. You're not better than anyone. And so what would happen to your pride if you actually believed that? How could you go on trying to be at the center of all things if you really believed that you deserved the cross? I mean, we say that we believe it, but the truth is that it's what we do and it's how we act that exposes what we really believe. Jesus bore our pride on the cross to pay the consequences for our pride, but also so that it would be possible for us to die to the pursuit of our own glory and acknowledge that we really do deserve the cross. But if we were to realize how sinful we are and that we really do deserve the cross, how do we avoid falling into despair? How do you avoid the pride of inferiority? Take another look at this verse in 1 Peter. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Jesus died the death that you deserve. And by that, he paid for your sins. And the end of that verse makes that pretty clear, right? By his wounds you have been healed. There's no place for despair in the life of a child of God. There's no place for self-pity. Okay? There's no place for the pride of inferiority. Your God has paid the price for your sins, and now you're healed. Our Savior literally took our place. He takes our pride and he dies our death, and then he offers us his righteousness. He offers us his humility. Jesus never had to be humble. He was God. All right, it wouldn't have been weird or sinful for him to demand to be at the center. He is the center. But if he wanted to save sinners and people that were full of pride, that's us, then he would have to be humble in all the ways that we cannot be. Jesus humbled himself so that he could give us his perfect humility. There's really only one way to stop grasping for being at the center, and that's to find someone that we believe is more worthy than we are to be at the center. And the only way to stop making life all about you is to find the one who's greater than we are and choose to make our life all about him. And I'm going to say something here that you're going to chuckle about because it's so ridiculous and so obviously true. But if you actually believed it in a way that wasn't like purely academic, then it would change everything about the way that you live your life. Here it is. Jesus is better than you. All right? He's more worthy of the center than you are. And it's not just because he's God. It's also because he has loved you and he's given his life for you. And the main reason that we try so hard to be at the center is because we think that if someone besides us is at the center, then we're not going to be taken care of. All right, but we can really just let that go. Jesus alone is worthy of being at the center of all things. He's not going to forget about us. He's not going to do things that are not what's best for you. He can take better care of you than you can. Hebrews 13, Jesus is quoted as saying that he will never leave you or forsake you. You just need to take your eyes off yourself and let the beauty and the worth of Jesus overwhelm you. To let his love and his power and his majesty and his glory captivate your attention. Right? Let his kindness and his mercy like wash over you. To let his promises protect you. And let his resurrection from the dead give you an eternal hope for life. All right? He's already at the center of all things. Okay? Our lives would be so much different and so much better if we would just really realize that. Not just like assent to it, but come to believe it in a way that changes our presuppositions and the way that we approach life.